The world was a rough burlap sack, and the biting cold, that's all I knew for what felt like an eternity. The sack over my head smelled of dirt and old potatoes, scratching my cheeks raw. My wrists were bound so tightly the rope had chafed them bloody, the sharp sting a constant reminder of my helplessness. My feet, clad in thin house slippers, stumbled over frozen earth and sharp stones, dragged forward by unseen hands. I didn't need to see them to know who they were. Their grunts were familiar, their callous grip unmistakable. The wind was a monster up here on the ridge. It screamed in my ears and tore at my thin nightdress, stealing the air from my lungs before I could even think to draw a full breath. It was a cold that didn't just chill the skin, it sank into your bones, a deep, predatory cold that promised a final, dreamless sleep. Then, a voice cut through the wind's howl, a familiar poison that curdled the blood in my veins. "You've brought shame on this family, Elara," my stepfather, Marcus, spat. His words were close, laced with a false piety that was far more repulsive than the sack on my head. "A good daughter obeys. She brings honor to her father's house." Fury, hot and sharp, flared in my chest. Father? He had never been a father to me. He was just the man my mother had married, the man whose shadow had fallen over our home the day my real father was buried. "Sheriff Thorne is a powerful man," Marcus continued, his voice rising to be heard over the gale. "A respectable man. He offered you his name, his protection. You should have been on your knees with gratitude. Instead, you spat in his face. You spat in mine." I thought of Sheriff Thorne, his damp, fleshy hands and the way his eyes would linger on me, stripping me bare long before he ever laid a finger on me. He wasn't a respectable man. He was a vulture in a tin star, circling the weak and the vulnerable. Marrying him would have been a fate worse than any cliff's edge. My refusal hadn't been an act of childish defiance. It had been an act of survival. My stumbling feet came to an abrupt halt. The hands holding my arms tightened their grip, turning me to face the wailing emptiness. I could feel it even through my boots, the solid ground giving way to nothing. The wind pushed at my back, an eager accomplice to their treachery. Someone yanked the sack from my head. The sudden, blinding light of the gray, pre-dawn sky made me gasp. Below me, the world fell away into a chasm of jagged rock and snow-dusted pines. The valley floor was a distant, hazy dream. I was standing on the precipice of my own grave. I looked at the men. 2 of Thorne's deputies, their faces grim and unfeeling, and beside them, Marcus. There was no remorse in his eyes, only a cold, hard fury. He saw me not as a daughter, but as a broken contract, a failed investment. "This is what happens to willful girls," he said, his voice now calm, terrifyingly so. "You chose this." A scream tried to tear from my throat, but the wind stole it, ripping it away before it could be born. I thrashed, a useless, frantic struggle against their iron grips. I kicked and twisted, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. For a moment I almost threw one of the deputies off balance, a spark of hope that was extinguished as quickly as it came. Then came the shove. It wasn't a dramatic push, not a struggle at the edge. It was a simple, brutal, businesslike act, a hard shove in the center of my back. My feet left the ledge, and for one heart-stopping second I was weightless, suspended between the life I had known and the death that awaited. The sky and the rock and the snow all blurred into one terrifying swirl of gray and white. My last thought wasn't of fear, but of his face, the chilling indifference of the man who had sold me for a bit of favor with the law. The wind rushed past me, a final, deafening roar. The world went silent, then it went black. The first thing I knew was pain. It wasn't the quick, sharp sting of a cut or the dull ache of a bruise. This was a deep, foundational agony, a white-hot scream that started in my leg and radiated through every inch of my body, setting my very bones on fire. For a moment, I was nothing but that pain, a disembodied consciousness trapped in a cage of shattered nerves. Then came the cold, It was a vicious, biting cold that seeped through my thin nightdress, a stark contrast to the fire inside me. I felt the wet chill of snow against my cheek and the rough scrape of ice crystals. My eyelids fluttered open to a world of blinding white. Snow. I was buried in it, half entombed in a drift at the bottom of a ravine. Memory returned like a punch to the gut, the wind, the cliff, Marcus's cold eyes, the shove. I was supposed to be dead. My gaze drifted upward, past the sheer rock face to the jagged line of the ridge against the slate-gray sky. It seemed a lifetime away. Looking down, I saw what had saved me. A thick, gnarled pine branch, snapped and splintered, jutted out from the cliffside about 20 feet up. My nightdress was torn. A long, bloody gash ran down my side where it must have snagged me, slowing my fall just enough to spare my life, saved by a tree. The irony was a bitter pill. They had thrown me away like trash, and the wilderness itself had refused to take me. A fresh wave of pain brought a groan from my lips. My left leg was twisted at an angle that made my stomach churn. Broken, my ribs felt like a cage of shattered glass with every shallow, ragged breath I took. But I was breathing. My heart, though faint, was still beating. I was alive. And that was enough to ignite a different kind of fire inside me, a stubborn, spiteful ember of defiance. I would not die here. I would not give Marcus and Sheriff Thorne the satisfaction of my quiet, frozen death. They wanted me gone? They would have to try again. The thought became a mantra, a silent chant against the creeping numbness in my fingers and toes. I will not die here. Using my good arm and my good leg, I began to move. It was less of a crawl and more of a pathetic, agonizing drag. Every motion sent lightning bolts of pain through my body. I dug my fingers into the snow, heaving my broken form forward an inch at a time, leaving a smeared, crimson trail behind me. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away from the base of that cliff, away from the scene of my own murder. The snow was a relentless enemy sucking the warmth from me, but it was also a shield, hiding me from view. Time lost all meaning. There was only the snow, the pain, and the burning need to survive. The world narrowed to the few feet in front of me until, eventually, my strength gave out. My arm buckled. My head fell into the snow. The cold, a welcome relief from the exertion. This was it. I had tried. My eyelids felt impossibly heavy. Perhaps sleep wasn't so bad after all. That's when a shadow fell over me. I flinched, my heart seizing with a fresh terror. Was it one of Thorne's men, sent down to make sure the job was done? I twisted my head, blinking snow from my lashes, and looked up. A man stood over me, as silent as the falling snow. He was tall and broad, dressed in buckskins and furs, a heavy axe resting on his shoulder. His face was obscured by a thick, dark beard, but his eyes were clear and still, like the surface of a frozen lake. They held no malice, no pity, just a quiet, steady observance. He said nothing. He simply knelt beside me, his movements slow and deliberate, as if not to startle a wounded animal. He set his axe down carefully. His large, gloved hands hovered over me for a second before one gently brushed the snow from my face. The touch was so unexpectedly tender it brought a fresh wave of tears to my eyes. Without a word, he slid his arms beneath me. The world tilted and exploded in pain as my broken body was lifted from the ground, a strangled cry escaping my lips. But his hold was firm, secure. He cradled me against his solid chest as if I weighed nothing, his warmth a shocking comfort against the freezing air. He carried me to a sturdy-looking horse waiting patiently nearby, wrapping me in a thick wool blanket from its saddle roll before mounting and settling me in front of him. As the horse began to walk, its rhythmic gait lulling me into a state between waking and dreaming, I leaned my head back against his chest. I was being carried away from my grave by a silent stranger, a ghost of the mountain. He hadn't asked my name, he hadn't asked what happened. He had simply seen a person in need and acted. For the first time since my world had shattered, a flicker of something other than pain or fury stirred within me. It was a fragile, unfamiliar thing, but I knew its name, hope. I woke to the smell of pine and wood smoke. For a long moment I lay perfectly still, suspended in the disorienting space between a nightmare and reality. The agonizing cold was gone, replaced by a deep, penetrating warmth that seemed to radiate from a crackling fire somewhere nearby. I was on my back, covered by a heavy wool blanket that smelled of the forest and clean air. My head rested on a pillow stuffed with what felt like dried leaves. My eyes cracked open. Above me were rough-hewn wooden beams, darkened with age and smoke. A low fire danced in a stone hearth across the small, one-room cabin, casting flickering shadows on the walls. My gaze traveled downwards. My left leg was bound tightly in a splint, the work rough but firm. The raw, searing pain from the fall had subsided into a deep, throbbing ache. Someone had tended to me. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through me. I tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness and a fresh spike of pain in my ribs sent me crashing back down with a choked gasp. A figure moved in the corner of my vision. It was the man from the mountain. He sat on a low stool by the fire, mending a piece of leather with a needle and thread. He must have heard my gasp, but he didn't turn. He didn't speak. He simply continued his work, his large hands surprisingly deft. His silence was a strange and unsettling gift. I expected questions, demands, or worse. All he offered was the steady, rhythmic crackle of the fire and the soft scrape of his needle through leather. Days bled into one another in a feverish, painful haze. My life narrowed to the small cot, the warmth of the fire, and the silent presence of my rescuer. He was a creature of routine. He would rise before the sun, stoke the fire, and slip out into the gray dawn. He would return hours later, leaving a bowl of warm, thin broth and a cup of water on a crate beside my bed before retreating to his side of the room. He never stared. He never tried to speak to me. He moved with a quiet purpose that filled the small cabin not with tension, but with a profound and steady calm. He was giving me space. I realized it on the third or fourth day, when my fever finally broke. I had been hiding, turning my face to the wall whenever he was near, pulling the blanket up to my chin like a shield. I didn't want to be seen, a broken thing on display. He seemed to understand this. He respected the invisible wall I had built around my cot, never crossing it unless it was to leave food or add a log to the fire. My wrists were still bound. The ropes, frayed and stained with dried blood, were a constant, chafing reminder of my stepfather's betrayal. The mountain man must have seen them. He could have cut them in a second with the knife he wore at his belt. But he didn't. And in that choice, I understood something vital. He was leaving it to me. He was not my keeper, he was my host. He had freed me from the snow, but he was letting me choose when to free myself from my bonds. He was giving me back a piece of the power that had been stolen from me. One afternoon, the cabin was quiet, except for the distant, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of his axe splitting wood outside. The low, winter sun streamed through the single, grimy window pane, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The broth he'd left was still warm. I drank it slowly, the simple nourishment a balm to my empty stomach. My gaze fell to my wrists. The ropes were ugly, a brand of my humiliation. They tied me to the cliff, to Marcus's voice, to the terrifying, weightless fall. I looked from the ropes to the door, listening to the steady sound of his work. It was a sound of life, of normalcy. Here in this quiet cabin, I was not a problem to be disposed of. I was not a willful girl bringing shame. I was just here, safe. With my good hand, I began to work at the knot on my left wrist. My fingers were clumsy and weak, the rope stiff and unforgiving. It scraped against my raw skin, but I ignored the sting. Tears of frustration and pain welled in my eyes, but I blinked them away. This was my battle. The knot finally gave, loosening its grip. I slid the rope off, my wrist red and raw beneath it. Then I did the other. When both ropes lay coiled on the blanket, I stared at my hands. They were mine again. Trembling, bruised, but mine. I tucked them under the blanket, curling my fingers into a fist. It was the first choice I had made for myself since I'd refused to marry the sheriff. A small act of defiance in a sanctuary built of silence and respect. The man outside continued his work, oblivious. But in the quiet warmth of the cabin, I had just taken my first breath of freedom. For days, the world remained a quiet loop of sleeping, waking, and sipping the broth he left for me. The splint on my leg was a cage, my bruised ribs a constant, sharp reminder. But with my wrists free, a restless energy began to stir within me. It was the energy of a creature that has been cornered and is finally realizing the trap has an opening. I was still broken, but I was no longer bound. One morning, after Silas had left with his axe and the silence of the cabin settled around me, I decided I could not lie on that cot for one more second. Using a sturdy branch he'd left by the bed as a crutch, I pulled myself to a standing position. A wave of blackness swarmed my vision, and I gripped the wall, my knuckles white, waiting for it to pass. When it did, I took my first halting steps. My reflection in the grimy window pane stopped me cold. I saw a ghost, a wild thing. My face was a mess of yellowing bruises and pale skin, but it was my hair that horrified me. Once my pride, long and thick, it was now a tangled, matted nest, caked with dried blood, dirt, and pine needles. It was the hair of a victim. It was the physical manifestation of my fall, of my humiliation. It stank of my near death. A fierce, desperate need to be rid of it consumed me. I hobbled around the small cabin, my eyes scanning every surface. His belongings were sparse and practical. A few chipped plates, a cast iron pot, a neatly folded stack of blankets. In a small wooden box, I found them. A pair of heavy, rust-pocked shears, used for trimming sheep or perhaps leather. They were perfect. Sitting on the floor by the hearth, I took the shears in my good hand and began to cut. It wasn't a neat or gentle process. It was a brutal hacking, a sawing motion to get through the thick, knotted clumps. Chunks of my past fell away, landing on the dusty floorboards. With each severed lock, I felt a strange, thrilling lightness. I was severing the ties to Marcus, to Sheriff Thorne, to the girl who was too weak to fight back on the cliff's edge. When I was done, my hair was a ragged, uneven shock that barely brushed my ears. I ran a trembling hand over it. It was ugly, but it was mine. I was no one's pretty doll anymore. Feeling cleansed, I sought to shed the last piece of my old life, the torn and bloodied nightdress. In a dusty wooden chest at the foot of his cot, I found a small collection of folded clothes. Tucked at the very bottom was a dress. It was made of simple cotton, faded to the color of pale winter sunlight. It was old and worn, with a tear in the sleeve and a seam coming loose at the waist. It was also clean. I pulled off the ruined nightdress, casting it into the fire and watching the fabric blacken and curl into ash. Then I slipped the yellow dress over my head. It was too big in the shoulders and too short in the sleeves, but it felt like a suit of armor. In the same box as the shears, I'd found a needle and a spool of dark thread. For the rest of the afternoon, I sat by the fire, my broken leg propped on a stool, and mended that dress. My stitches were clumsy and uneven, a dark scar against the pale yellow fabric, but they were strong. With every pass of the needle, I felt like I was mending something deeper inside myself. I was pulling the frayed edges of my own life back together. I didn't hear Silas return. The soft scuff of his boots on the floor was the first I knew of his presence. I froze, needle in midair, my heart jumping into my throat. He stood in the doorway, snow dusting his shoulders, his arms full of firewood. His gaze took in the scene. The fire, my shorn hair scattered on the floor, Me in the mended yellow dress. I waited for a reaction. Surprise, anger, a question. He gave none. He simply blinked, a slow, deliberate motion. Then he walked to the hearth, deposited the wood, and turned to face me. The silence in the cabin was different now. It wasn't empty. It was full of everything unsaid. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, like stones rubbing together. "Silas!" It took me a moment to understand he was offering his name. I looked up from my sewing, meeting his calm, steady eyes for the first time without fear. "Elara," I whispered, the name feeling strange and new on my own tongue. He gave a single small nod, that was all, an exchange of names, a simple acknowledgement of existence. But, in that quiet moment, a fragile seam was mended between two solitary people. A tentative but deep connection was forged in the shared silence, a silent promise that here, in this quiet cabin, we were no longer just ghosts. The days in Silas's cabin settled into a quiet rhythm, a language of gestures that needed no words. He would tend to my splint, his rough hands surprisingly gentle, and I would sweep the hearth. He would leave for hours to hunt or trap, and I would practice walking, my steps growing stronger, the branch he gave me a third and steady leg. We moved around each other in the small space, two solitary planets held in a delicate, silent orbit. The peace was fragile, I knew, but it was real. I had started to feel less like a ghost and more like a person again. The peace was shattered by a knock on the door. It was a sharp alien sound, a fist rapping against the heavy wood that reverberated through the cabin and straight into my bones. Silas, who was sharpening his knife by the fire, went perfectly still. His head lifted, his eyes fixed on the door. He had the focused stillness of a wolf that has scented danger on the wind. I froze by the cot, my heart instantly hammering a frantic, familiar rhythm against my broken ribs. "No one ever came here." Silas rose slowly, placing his knife on the mantelpiece before moving to the door. He didn't open it all the way, just a crack, his broad body filling the gap. I could see a sliver of a woman standing outside, wrapped in a thick wool shawl, her face pinched by the cold and something else, impatience. "Silas," her voice was thin and dry as autumn leaves. "Martha Gable, from the general store, my husband saw your smoke." Silas said nothing. His silence was a wall. "We all know you like your privacy," she continued, her voice pushing into the quiet of the cabin. "But folks are talking. Talk of you taking in a guest." The way she said the word made my blood run cold. It was a loaded, knowing term, thick with gossip and suspicion. "Found up by the ridge, they say." My breath caught in my throat. They knew. The invisible shield I had imagined around this cabin had dissolved. The town of Stone Creek, the place I had once called home, was aware of my existence. "Sheriff Thorne has been asking questions," Mrs. Gable went on, her tone turning sharp with warning. "He's not a patient man, Silas. You know that. Harboring a runaway, and one who's made an enemy of the sheriff, at that, is a dangerous business. Whatever trouble she's in, it's going to come find you. You'd be wise to send her on her way before it does." Silas's reply was a low rumble, too quiet for me to make out the words, but the finality in his tone was clear. A moment later he shut the door, the heavy thud sealing us back inside. But the silence was different now. It was poisoned. The sanctuary had been breached. Panic, blinding and absolute, took hold of me. The walls of the cabin seemed to shrink, the air growing thick and suffocating. I couldn't stay. They would come for me. Thorne's men, my stepfather, they would drag me back, and this time there would be no mistakes. The wilderness, the brutal cold, the very real threat of starvation, all of it seemed like a safer bet than the cruelty of men. "I have to go," I choked out, scrambling for the branch I used as a crutch. My movements were clumsy, desperate. "He'll find me here. I can't let him." I stumbled towards the door, my mind a frantic blur of escape. I would run, hide in the deep woods where they'd never look. I was a trapped animal, ready to chew off its own leg to get free. Silas moved, blocking the door with his body. He wasn't threatening, just there. A mountain, solid and unmovable. "Let me pass," I pleaded, my voice cracking. "Please, they'll hurt you too." He looked down at me, his face impassive, but his eyes holding an intensity I'd never seen before. His silence was not empty. It was a weight, a counterbalance to my frantic terror. He saw the wild fear in my eyes, the same fear he'd seen when he found me broken in the snow. He reached out, not to grab me, but to gently take the crutch from my trembling hand. Then he spoke, his voice the calm in my storm. "They won't find you." It wasn't a guess or a hope. It was a promise, spoken with an unshakable certainty that defied all reason. It cut through my panic like a sharp blade. I stared up at him, this quiet man who had asked for nothing, who had offered me a silent respect I'd never known. He was not afraid. He was standing his ground. And he was offering to stand it for me. My wild flight to the door stalled. The adrenaline ebbed, leaving me trembling and weak. I looked from the sturdy wood of the door to the resolute strength in his eyes. Running had been my only instinct. But here, now, another option presented itself. To stay. To trust. Taking a shuddering breath, I gave a small, jerky nod. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was no longer in control. His quiet resolve had convinced me. I would not flee into the wilderness again. I would stand with him and face what was coming. The mended yellow dress felt less like clothing and more like armor. The dark, uneven stitches I'd made were a map of my own repairs, a testament to the fact that I could be torn apart and still put myself back together. My hair, short and ragged, felt like a declaration of war against the girl I used to be. As I walked beside Silas down the steep track from his cabin, I was not the terrified victim who had fled up this mountain. I was a survivor returning to the scene of the crime on my own terms. We emerged from the tree line at the edge of Stone Creek. The town looked exactly the same, yet entirely different. The familiar storefronts, Gable's General Store, the saloon, the blacksmith's forge, now seemed like a stage set for my judgment. As we walked down the muddy main street, heads began to turn. Doors opened a crack. Faces appeared in windows. The town's collective breath seemed to hold, then release in a torrent of hushed whispers that followed us like a cloud of flies. "Is that her? The one Thorne was supposed to marry. Look at her hair and that dress." Walking with the mountain man, shameless, I felt their words like tiny, stinging needles. My first instinct was to shrink, to look at the ground, to hide inside myself. But then I felt Silas's presence beside me. He didn't look at the gawking townspeople. His gaze was fixed straight ahead, his stride even, and deliberate. He was a silent, solid mountain in the midst of their chattering storm, and I drew strength from him. I lifted my chin, met their stares, and kept walking. Our destination was the general store. The little bell above the door chimed, a sound that had once meant candy and kindness from Mrs. Gable. Today, it sounded like an alarm. Mr. Gable stood behind the counter, a short, balding man with nervous eyes. He took one look at me, and his face paled. He began polishing the counter with a rag, his movements jerky and agitated. "Silas," he said, not meeting his eyes, "didn't expect to see you." His gaze flickered to me, then quickly away, as if looking at me too long might bring trouble to his doorstep. "Heard you had company." "We need supplies," Silas said, his voice calm and even, cutting through the thick tension in the room. He handed Mr. Gable a list. As Mr. Gable scurried to gather the items, flour, salt, coffee, I felt a different pair of eyes on me. Sheriff Thorne stood in the doorway, blocking the afternoon light. He was just as I remembered, barrel-chested, with a face that seemed perpetually flushed with drink and arrogance. His tin star was polished to a high shine, a stark contrast to the darkness in his eyes. "Well, well," he drawled, a smirk playing on his lips. "Look what the mountain cat dragged in." He strode into the store, the jingle of his spurs the only sound. He stopped directly in front of me, so close I could smell the stale whiskey on his breath. "I was worried about you, Elara. Thought you might have gotten lost in the woods." The lie was so blatant, so audacious, it stole my breath. This man who had orchestrated my murder was pretending concern. "Your stepfather is worried sick," he continued, his voice dropping to a low, possessive growl. "It's time for you to come home now. We can forget all this foolishness." He reached out to grab my arm, to claim me like a piece of property. The old Elara would have flinched. The old Elara would have submitted. But I was not the old Elara. "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the silent store with the force of a gunshot. Thorne froze, his hand hovering in the air. Mr. Gable stopped his nervous fidgeting. Even Silas, who had been watching from the counter, seemed to hold his breath. Thorne's smirk faltered. "What did you say?" I found my voice, and this time it was stronger. I said, "No, I am not going anywhere with you." A flicker of shock, then pure fury crossed his face. He was not used to being denied. "You don't have a choice, girl. You belong with me." She said, "No, Sheriff." The new voice came from the doorway. It was Widow Finch, a stern woman whose husband had died in the mines. She stood with her arms crossed, her expression fierce. "A person's got a right to say no." "The girl has been through an ordeal," another voice added gently. Reverend Cole stood beside the widow, his hands clasped in front of him. "Perhaps she needs compassion, not coercion." Sheriff Thorne looked from the widow to the Reverend, his face turning a shade of purple. He was losing control of the narrative, right here in front of everyone. The whispers of the townspeople had not been just mockery. They had been laced with fear, and now, seeing two of their own speak up, a tiny spark of defiance was lit. For the first time, someone other than me was challenging his absolute authority. He shot me a look of pure venom, a promise of future retribution. But for now he was cornered. With a snarled curse, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the store. I stood there, my legs trembling but my spirit soaring. I had faced him. I had found my voice. And I was not alone. The seeds of dissent had been planted in the rocky soil of Stone Creek, all because of a quiet no from the woman in the mended yellow dress. The path to the ridge was a pilgrimage of ghosts. Every twisted root and sharp stone was a memory of being dragged, helpless and hooded, toward my doom. But this time, I walked it myself. My steps were steady, aided by the branch Silas had smoothed into a proper crutch. The yellow dress, my armor, was hidden beneath a heavy wool cloak. In my hand I clutched a folded piece of paper, a document as sharp and true as any blade. Silas walked beside me, his presence a silent bastion of strength. He carried no weapon but the axe slung on his back, a tool of his trade. He hadn't asked why I needed to return to that terrible place. He seemed to understand that some demons cannot be outrun. They must be faced on their own ground. We reached the cliff's edge. The wind was just as cruel as I remembered, whipping my short hair across my face and trying to steal my breath. But this time I stood firm against it. I looked down into the chasm where I was supposed to have died, at the splintered pine branch that had saved me. The place no longer held the same terror. It was just rock and air and snow. The power it held over me was a memory, and memories could be rewritten. We didn't have to wait long. The sound of approaching horses announced their arrival. Sheriff Thorne, two of his thuggish deputies, and my stepfather, Marcus, rode up and dismounted, their movements full of arrogant confidence. They were here to finish what they had started. "I knew you'd come to your senses, Elara," Marcus said, his voice slick with false paternal warmth. "This mountain savage has clearly addled your mind. Come now, it's time to go home and prepare for your wedding." Sheriff Thorne smirked, his hand resting possessively on the butt of his pistol. "Your little show in town was impressive, I'll admit, but this is where reality sets in. There are no prying eyes up here, no reverends or widows to save you." He took a step forward, his intent clear, but I held up my hand, not in surrender, but to command him to stop. Then, I unfolded the piece of paper. "This document," I said, my voice clear and strong, carrying over the howl of the wind, "is a legal affidavit. It was written for me by Reverend Cole." I saw a flicker of surprise in Thorne's eyes. Marcus's smile tightened. "It details the events of the night you brought me here," I continued, my gaze locking onto my stepfather. "It describes how you, Marcus, my legal guardian, conspired with the sheriff of Stone Creek to murder me for refusing a forced marriage. It states that you dragged me from my bed, bound and hooded me, and threw me from this very cliff." Marcus paled, his blustering facade beginning to crack. "Lies! The hysterical ramblings of a troubled girl." "It has been witnessed and signed," I said, my voice like ice, "by Widow Finch, who heard you threaten me a week before, by Mr. Gable, who saw you meeting with the sheriff's men the night I disappeared, and by Reverend Cole himself. He made 2 copies. One is with him. The other is on its way to the territorial marshal in the capital." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the screaming wind. Thorne's smirk was gone, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. He had built his power on secrets and fear, and I had just dragged his secrets into the light. "You're bluffing," Thorne snarled, but the conviction in his voice was gone. He was a bully who had just been punched in the mouth. "Am I?" I asked, taking a step closer to the edge, the paper held firmly in my hand. "The marshal will want to know why the sheriff's fiancée ended up broken at the bottom of a ravine. He'll want to know why her stepfather, who stood to gain from the match, was the last to see her. Your stories won't hold up, Sheriff. Not against this." I looked from Thorne's furious face to Marcus's crumbling composure. I saw them for what they were: small, cruel men, terrified of losing the power they had so viciously acquired. The fear I had carried for so long had vanished, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. "You have no claim on me," I told them, my voice ringing with the unshakable truth. "Not legally, not morally, not anymore." Thorne's hand twitched toward his gun, his last resort, but before he could draw, Silas shifted his weight. It was a small movement, but it was enough. He planted the end of his crutch on the ground and leaned against the rock wall. His eyes, fixed on Thorne, were flat and deadly. He didn't need to say a word. The message was clear. Try it. Defeat settled over them like a shroud. Thorne looked at Silas, at my unwavering gaze, at the damning paper in my hand. He was a snake with its fangs pulled. With a final, venomous glare, he turned, shoved past his deputies, and mounted his horse. Marcus, looking utterly broken, stumbled after him. They rode away without a backward glance, their power dissolving into the cold mountain air. I stood there on the edge of the cliff, the wind whipping the cloak around me, and watched them go. The place of my greatest trauma had become the site of my greatest victory. I had faced my abusers not with fear but with truth, and I had won. The sound of their horses faded into the wind, leaving only the vast, indifferent silence of the mountains. The tension that had held my body rigid for days finally released its grip, and I swayed on my feet, suddenly lightheaded. Silas's hand was there in an instant, a steadying presence on my arm, his touch warm through the thick wool of my cloak. I looked down at the paper still clutched in my hand. The ink was slightly smeared, the edges ruffled by the wind. It was just a piece of paper, but it held the weight of my freedom. Slowly, deliberately, I tore it into small pieces. I didn't need it anymore. Its purpose was served. I opened my hand and let the wind take the fragments, scattering them like white confetti into the chasm below. They danced and swirled, disappearing into the very air that had once rushed past me in my terrifying fall. It was a final, symbolic release. The story was told, the truth was out, and I was no longer bound to it. I turned my back on the cliff's edge forever. The power that the place, the sheriff, and my stepfather had held over me was broken, its fragments now as meaningless as the scraps of paper I had just released. I took a deep breath of the cold, clean air. It didn't steal my breath this time. It filled my lungs, a promise of life. The walk back down the mountain was different. The path no longer felt haunted by the ghosts of my past. Each step was a step forward, a deliberate move toward a future I was now free to choose for myself. The silence between Silas and me was different too. It was no longer a space built of necessity and caution, but one of comfort and deep, mutual understanding. We had faced the wolves together, and the quiet bond forged in his cabin had been tempered into something unbreakable on that cliff. When his cabin came into view through the pines, a wave of emotion washed over me, so potent it made my eyes sting. The first time I saw it, I was a broken, half-dead thing being carried to shelter. Now I saw it for what it truly was. It wasn't a temporary refuge or a hiding place. The rough-hewn logs, the curl of smoke from the stone chimney, the sturdy door that had kept the world at bay. This was not a shelter, it was home. As we reached the door, Silas paused. He looked from the cabin to me, his gaze soft, questioning. He had brought me here to heal, never assuming I would stay. In his quiet, respectful way, he was giving me a choice one last time. I could keep walking down the path to Stone Creek and whatever life I might build there, or I could stop here. I gave him a small, weary smile. My journey was over. I was already home. I reached out and laid my hand on the rough wood of the door, a silent answer to his unasked question. He gave a single, slow nod of understanding. He pushed the door open, stepping aside to let me enter first. The warmth from the hearth washed over me, a familiar and welcome embrace. The small cabin was exactly as we'd left it. My mended yellow dress folded neatly on the cot, the scent of pine and wood smoke in the air, the 2 tin cups sitting on the small table. It was a simple, quiet life held within these 4 walls, but it was real. It was a life built on a foundation of respect, not fear, of actions, not empty words. I walked to the fire and held my hands out to the flames, feeling the weariness of the day settle deep into my bones. It was the good kind of tired, the exhaustion that comes after a battle well fought. Silas came to stand beside me, adding a fresh log to the fire, the crackle and pop of the burning wood, the only sound between us. We stood there for a long time, watching the flames dance. No words were needed. The future was an unspoken promise in the air between us. It wouldn't be a life of grand declarations or passionate speeches. It would be a life like this moment, quiet, steady, and warm. A life built not on what was said, but on what was understood. Together, we had faced the darkness, and together we had found the path home.